This last summer, I was able to go on holiday with Katrina to the Lake District, and we had a fantastic time, a great week. And one of the things we did was we were able to walk up a little hill. It wasn't a massive mountain, but it was up a hill called Cat Bells. Some of you may have been there. It runs alongside Lake Derwent, outside of Keswick. And as we went along and climbed up it's a little bit like the Malverns, along that range of hills there. We were going up and down peaks and troughs, and of course as we were slowly climbing, and every time we got to a high point we would stop and we'd turn around and look back, and of course we'd admire the view. And it was fantastic. We could see Lake Derwent on the right. In the far distance we could see Bassenthwaite, we could see mountains, we could see hills, we could see the town of Keswick, and it was breathtaking. And also as we looked down we could see the ups and downs that we'd come along. We could see the pathway, which was winding. It wasn't actually going in a straight line. We could see rocks and boulders and obstacles that were in the way, things that perhaps could have distracted us. And we were able to just pause and every now and again enjoy and wonder, not just at God's creation, but at the pathway that we'd come. And I think it's really important that as we seek to grow in patience, that actually we take time to pause, to wonder, to kind of like we were on that hilltop there, just to stop on our journey of life. And I'm not a great fan of looking back for too long, but sometimes it's just good just to look back a little bit and to see, yes, there's been ups and there's been downs along the way. Yes, the path has been windy. Sometimes it's not gone in straight lines, and sometimes it seems to veer off in directions taking us away, and then it suddenly comes back around. There's obstacles, there's distractions along the way. But actually, as we look back, we can also see along the way, God is at work in our lives. And those are the times we just can stop and we can look and we just wonder at his greatness and wonder and marvel at what he is doing behind the scenes in our lives. And we've been going through the life of Joseph, and as we've gone through the life of Joseph, you can see that he clearly did that. He obviously stopped and he reflected and he wondered in his life, and he saw the ups and downs of his life, the fact that he was the privileged son born to his father in his old age, given that special coat, and then as a result hated by his brothers, the down of being hated by them. They wanted to kill him, they threw him in the pit. They then sold him off to slavery. And if that wasn't bad enough, he was then shoved in a prison for something he hadn't done. But then he had the remarkable experience of going from a prison to suddenly catapulted into the presence of the world's most powerful man at that time, Pharaoh. And his life was ups and his life was downs. But as he looked back and upon his life, he could see another hand at work behind the scenes of his life. He could see the work of God. And so when it came to that moment when his brothers came to him looking for food because there was famine in the land, and he got to that point when he was ready to show them and say to them who he was, really was. There's an amazing sort of passage in Genesis chapter 45, and he says these words to his brothers in verse 3. He said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. "Please come closer," he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me in this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither ploughing or harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and tell him, this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt. So come down to me immediately." Wow, what a dramatic scene that must have made when Joseph made that revelation to his brothers who had no idea who he was. But you see, he was able to say all those things because he'd paused and he'd wondered at what God had been doing in his life. And I think it's important for us, wherever we are on this spiritual journey, at times, periodically, we can just pause and look back and wonder at what God has done in our life. You see, Joseph could look back and he could see how God had guided him. He said 4 times there to his brothers, it was in verse 6, he said, "It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives." Verse 7, he said, "God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive." Verse 8, he said, "So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace." And then if they hadn't quite got it by then, verse 9, he says, "God made me master over all the land of Egypt." You see, it may have been his brothers who were the physical reason why he was thrown into slavery. But actually, he's saying that actually there was another hand behind all these things. God wasn't necessarily doing these bad things to me, but actually God had a plan, and his plan was to get me into the palace. And I could see how God used human sinfulness and brought good things even out of that, and to get me to where he wanted me to be, and in the kind of condition that I could be useful to him. And so he was able to see and recognize God's hands of guidance. And I think he also could recognize and see God's hand of protection. Later on in his life, right towards the end, in Genesis, the last chapter of Genesis, chapter 50 and verse 20, he said on this other occasion to his brothers, he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, so that I could preserve the lives of many people." You see, Joseph has seen, not only was he able to bring protection through the way in which they were to store up the food in the good years and then feed it in the bad years afterwards when the years of famine came along, but also how God had protected him personally in his life, in the different seasons of life when his brothers intended to harm him, but actually God had used it for good. And I can look back on my own life, and I'm sure you probably can do the same too, and see how God has protected me in different situations and different stages of my life. I can think of a number of scrapes in cars, but one in particular when I was a passenger, when I was reasonably young, and I just do not know how a major, almost certain fatal accident didn't take place. We were literally millimeters from it being absolutely catastrophic, but somehow God had preserved us and protected us so that the collision of those two vehicles didn't impact a millisecond later. I can think of how, especially in my younger years, I was drawn into relationships which would have been quite detrimental for me, but God was able to actually use other relationships to swing me in a different way, and just to help me to not to get sucked into things that I'm sure I would have not been able to cope with and would have been too much for me. In my farming life as a part of a farming business, before I became pastor of the church here, I can remember we had a number of times financially where things happened where we were owed as a business huge amounts of money because other companies went bankrupt, and it looked to overwhelm us and completely threaten the whole business. And yes, it took years to resolve, but yet somehow God protected us from total disaster. And we always had a roof over our heads, and we always had bread on the table. You see, God protected. And as I look back to, like Joseph, I can see how in all those different things, God had brought good out of bad. God brought good out of bad. Now, I'm aware that for some of you today, you're listening to me today, so well, that's okay for you. You can see that. Your life is going swimmingly. My life's not. You might feel your life's a mess, and you can't see evidence of God's protection and guidance in your life. Well, I doubt whether Joseph could at times either. I doubt whether his brothers wanted to kill him. He could see much evidence of good in that. I doubt whether when he was thrown into that pit, he was able to see much of God's good hand working there. When he was sold into slavery, when he was accused of raping his boss's wife and thrown into prison, I doubt whether at those times Joseph could see and reflect and see something of God's good hand. I expect he was probably feeling the same as you. It's only later. But let me encourage you just to look for those little hints of God at work behind the scenes of your life. Maybe someone who in the midst of all that you're going through, who's just smiles at you and shows something of God's love through their smile, and is friendly and helpful. Someone who's kind, someone who's gracious in the midst of all the other things swirling around you. Just look for those little hints and give thanks to God for those little good things, which are maybe small. And perhaps as you see those things, maybe God will open your eyes up one day to other things that he is doing behind the scenes of your life. You know, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, he wrote these words in Romans 8:28. He said, "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." Now notice this, he doesn't say everything is good. But what he does say is that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God. You see, there are hints in our lives. God uses every situation to bring out some good. And so when you see hints of good coming out of bad, give thanks to him for it. God specializes in bringing good out of bad situations in life. And so it's important that we recognize that even when we are unaware and things are tough and things are difficult, to know that actually God, in the midst of this pain, in the midst of this chaos, in the midst of what you're feeling and going through, God is somehow working behind the scenes, looking to bring out something good, something beautiful, even though maybe at this moment you can't always see it. But when you can, just give him thanks and honour him for it, and take time to pause to wonder at what he's doing. But then lastly, pause to wonder at God's patience with you. Wonder at God's patience with us, and what he does with, I wonder at his patience towards me. God was waiting for Joseph, in essence, to grow in maturity. In maturity, so he could handle the pressures, the responsibilities, the temptations of being number 2 in the world's greatest superpower at that time. You just think about it. If Joseph had been catapulted as a 17-year-old, slightly obnoxious, probably precocious young teenager into becoming number 2 in Pharaoh's palace, I think it would have been catastrophic. It would not have ended well. But God allowed him to go through this process so that he might grow and he might mature, and so he might be in that place where he had the practical skills, but he also had the character, life under his belt, learn life lessons which enabled him to move into that role and to discharge his responsibilities with wisdom and with grace and with skill and with godliness. You see, that is what God was seeking to do, and so it took God patience. But also, I think for us, God is waiting for us. What's he waiting for us to do? Well, he's not actually waiting for us to do anything. He's just waiting for us to grow up, to become more like Jesus, to grow up so we display that qualities of his Son in our lives more and more if we claim to be followers of Jesus. You see, in Romans 28 and verse 9, the very next verse after the one we just quoted, the apostle goes on and says, and he chose them, that's us, followers of Jesus, Christians, he chose them to become like his Son. He chose them to become like his Son, to become like Jesus, to become like him in character, so that our lives overflow with love, with joy, with peace, with patience, with kindness, with goodness, with faithfulness, gentleness and self-control. Then what we often would call the fruit of the Spirit, so that we cooperate with God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit, who works within our lives, so that these are seen in increasing measure in our lives. He's wanting us to become like Jesus. But you know what? If you're like me, so often I feel my life's like one step forward and one step back. One step forward, 2 steps back. Lessons that I thought I'd learned decades ago, I suddenly find myself having to relearn them. And it's frustrating and for us, but just think what it must be like for God, who's in his patience is just waiting for us to grow up, waiting for us to mature, waiting for us to become more like Jesus. and creating those opportunities for us to grow. But in the meanwhile, as we reflect on this, let's just give him thanks, give him praise for what he's done in our lives in the past, for what he's doing in the present, and for the fact that he is patient with us. He's patient so that we might come to faith in him. The Bible says he doesn't want anyone to perish, and so he's patiently waiting for everyone so they might have that opportunity to come to faith and to know Jesus personally. But also he's patient with us because he's wanting us and willing us to grow and to become more like him. And so let's just give him our thanks and give him our praise and give him our worship.